Welcome to Massey College. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Seniors Fellows Lunch today, where we have an in-person audience as well as an online audience. So welcome to this event. The college is slowly reopening, and we had our first formal dinner this week. We will have resuming the high tables, so we want to invite everybody as they feel comfortable to come back to the college. I want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to acknowledge the great privilege that we have to continue to gather here together to celebrate great work. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Mohamed Tavakoli-Targi to introduce our Senior Fellows lecturer today. Mohamed.
Greetings, everyone. It is an honor to introduce Mark Entwistle, who served as Ambassador of Canada to the Republic of Cuba from 1993 to 1997. In this position, he steered all elements of the historically significant and delicate relationship with Cuba, including political, commercial, and security relations. He was the architect of a dynamic trade development strategy. During his tenure, Canada became Cuba's largest trade and investment partner. Before the ambassadorial position, he served for 16 years from 1981 to 1997 as a professional Canadian diplomat. His foreign service career included assignments to the Canadian embassies in Tel Aviv and Moscow, where he was responsible for the bilateral relations between Canada and the then USSR. Do you remember? In this distinguished career, he served as Brian Mulroney's press secretary and director of communication, and Joe Clark's chief of staff and senior communication advisor. As a leading expert on Canada, Ambassador Entwistle is currently managing director of Acosta Cuba Capital Inc., a specialist business development and advisory firm focused exclusively on Cuba. And he is the managing director of Private Capital Inc., a boutique merchant bank in Toronto. Concurrently, he is the Canadian managing partner of Atlantic Advisory Partners, a joint partnership between Private Capital and German Spilsberg Partners. Ambassador Entwistle is the co-author of In the National Interest, Canadian Foreign Policy in an insecure world like today. In addition to authoring several book chapters, he writes and frequently speaks on international and Cuban affairs. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Entwistle. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I will say it's a real pleasure for me to be back here at Massey College after so many years. I was actually a junior fellow here back in the mists of time. And I have to say I have a very, very fond spot in my heart for Massey College. So I'd like to thank the principal and Professor Tavakoli-Targi for your very kind invitation to speak here today. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to romp at high speed through a range of thoughts about Cuba, necessarily at a fairly high level, but I'm also very happy, of course, to discuss anything in more detail later when we can get to questions, and I always find that the questions are so much more fun. In advance, I must admit to a certain bias, which I think you'll hear. I was formed educationally as a historian. And while I did not become a professional historian, instead joining the Canadian Diplomatic Service, I tend to pay a lot of attention to historical context and antecedents. Then the Cuban present doesn't look so artificially orphaned from the country's past. So why pay attention to Cuba at all? Even though the country dwarfs its island neighbors in the Caribbean basin, Cubans only make up about 1.15% of the global population, and the country makes up only about 0.1% of the world's landmass. When ranked by traditional measures like GDP, for example, Cuba is one of the smallest economies in the world. Yet, Cuba has taken up a much larger footprint than these figures might suggest. I think in people's imaginations, in its past and present contribution in world arts and culture and music, dance, visual arts and science, and more, and in the political bandwidth assigned to it in the foreign policies of the world's powers. Due to its unique political history since 1959, Cuba also maintains dialogue and connectivity with countries or political movements that we in Canada or the United States tend not to have. And there's some interesting examples of Cuban involvement in global diplomacy that I'd be happy to talk about later. Despite its current economic and social challenges, Cuba, I think, exudes a sense of potential. Culturally, Cuba is a richly woven, what I call a fusion society of Spanish and African origin, of course, via colonization and the slave trade, respectively, overlaid subsequently by French, Chinese, Italian, American, Jewish, Russian, and other influences over the years. The indigenous Siboney, Taino, and Guanajuato populations and their cultures were effectively annihilated following European contact in the 16th century. So Cuba is a kaleidoscope of differing realities that all exist simultaneously. There are multiple Cubas, depending on vantage point. Like any society, individuals all have unique experiences and different motivations. So when politicians, for example, of all kinds outside of Cuba, and especially in the United States, clamor to proclaim themselves to be defending the Cuban people, one does have to ask which Cuban people and on which issues. It is a country easy to stereotype, and I would even say to caricature, especially from the outside. Politically, as you all know, contemporary Cuba is a product of a revolutionary experience that has, to state the obvious, created institutions and political norms that are different from those in the liberal democratic world. There's, of course, no multi-party democracy, but that does not mean that there are no domestic politics or differences of view about the way forward into the future. Historically, in the period of the Republic, from 1902 to the coup d'etat led by Fulgencio Batista in 1952, the fledgling democratic institutions were weak, and almost all elections marred by political corruption and violence. Ironically, probably the only national election held before the Cuban Revolution in 1959 that could be considered free and fair was that of 1940, won by the same Mr. Batista. Even as the revolutionary Cuban government is criticized for failure to protect individual political rights to freedom of speech and assembly, for example, there is no glorious, democratic, pre-revolutionary past to hold up as an example. The Cuban people have had virtually no civic experience with clean and healthy functioning representative democracy throughout their entire history. Cuba is many things, but it's not an autocracy or unfettered dictatorship. That portrayal misses the more nuanced dynamics of how decisions are made in Cuba. Even under the more mercurial leadership style of Fidel Castro, where he unquestionably had expansive personal authority, the daily operations of the state were more structured, more process-driven, consultative, and systematic than one might have imagined from the outside. There are different authority centers that act as a kind of a Cuban version of checks and balances, and the Cubans have a strong governance capacity. Nor is it precisely a communist state. I think the label communist distracts from understanding the full nuance of Cuban realities. The real issue is one of sometimes dogmatic instinct rather than the label. To be sure, there is a single Communist Party of Cuba, but in its historical context, Fidel Castro, in effect, engineered a reverse takeover of the old Moscow-aligned Communist Party to acquire its organizational capabilities that were lacking in his own much more loosely organized 26 July movement. It was not really about a particular ideological predilection. There had always been an active communist movement in Cuban politics since the mid-1920s, and two communists, in fact, served as cabinet ministers in the wartime government of Fulgencio Batista, whose name keeps popping up, from 1940 to 1944. The Cuban governance model is nowadays, I think, more accurately characterized by more pragmatic and less ideological, goal-oriented policymaking. The Cuban state itself created a private sector that, despite some regulatory growing pains, exists and will continue to grow. The Cuban Constitution now recognizes private property. Contemporary Cuban socialism is a quite adaptable animal. I remember in the past listening to Fidel Castro speaking, laying out a whole bunch of ideas that were not at all what one would consider to be traditionally socialist or left-wing ideas about reform in the agricultural sector, et cetera. This was in a period after the fall of the Soviet Union when they were adapting to new realities. And at the end of that long list, and people are kind of scratching their head, he would simply proclaim, and that is Cuban socialism. So it has adapted and it can adapt. Cuba may be a bureaucratized state in the spirit of the institutionalized revolution. And here, think echoes of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or the PRI in Mexico, as Fidel Castro did himself in the 1990s. But it is not a failed state. Cubans widely are well educated. The country has enviable levels of universal literacy, a healthcare system that has been a model of community preventive care commended by World Health Organizations, and which produced health indicators like rates of infant mortality that were better than some much richer industrialized countries. All countries have national myths. The modern Cuban national identity, which was forged in the wars of independence against Spain in the second half of the 19th century, created the image of a kind of a mulatto society, blended, mixed, where all citizens are equally Cuban. The nation of with all and for all of José Martí, who the founding philosopher, father of the Cuban nation. That narrative of Cuban national identity persists to this day in the broad refusal to confront issues of race in Cuba. There can be no race issue because the matter was resolved many generations ago when Creole patriots and ex-African slaves joined together in a national project to rid the island of the Spaniards. This general unwillingness to acknowledge a national race question existed well before the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and has persisted throughout the revolutionary period. Cuba sits 90 miles from the United States, a twist of geographic fate that has meant that the history of Cuba has been interwoven with the United States in different ways for 2 centuries, including at least 3 serious discussions in the US about outright annexation in the 19th century. And of course, this American attention has not always been salutary. The United States maintains about 32 separate sanctions programs that target countries as a whole, or sanction individuals, organizations, or countries for things like their perceived support of terrorism, narcotics trafficking, weapons proliferation, or human rights abuses. Almost all of these programs are administered by the Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, of the US Treasury Department. When one looks at enforcement, almost 70% of all American sanction enforcement actions have been directed at only 2 of those programs of the 32, Cuba and Iran. 44.3% of all such enforcement actions between 2003 and 2017 were directed against one country alone, Cuba. This lopsided attention to Cuba in a world of perceived wrongdoers has been fairly consistent over time. In a 2007 report, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, determined, quote, after 2001, OFAC opened more investigations and imposed more penalties for embargo violations, such as buying Cuban cigars, than for violations of other sanctions, such as those on Iran. So some may wonder, how has the Cuban Revolution survived for over 6 decades? One explanation is that it must be the result of the authoritarian use of state power and oppression. There is, without question, a robust state security apparatus in Cuba, but that answer is not sufficient. I think the broader answer is much more nuanced. To answer the question, I would argue that there are at least 4 main elements or characteristics of the Cuban experience. I would break them down as follows. First, historical antecedents. 2, the quite effective appropriation of Cuban patriotism by the revolution in a communications war. Third, a social contract, or the idea of social contract. And fourth, the idea that there have in fact been different, adaptive Cuban revolutions. The first, existence of historical antecedent, is, I believe, a crucial element. A common assumption about revolutions is that they entail radical and sustained transformational changes in politics, society, and the economy. And in many ways, Cuban society, of course, underwent often traumatic upheaval after 1959. But in the case of the Cuban Revolution, I would argue that is actually most fully understood through its roots in Cuban history. That continuity with the past has been at least important as change, and works to stabilize the present. In this perception, the revolution becomes quintessentially Cuban, rather than the product of an imported ideology. The enduring Cubanness of the country today, la Cubanidad, would make it, in fact, recognizable to the great mid-20th century Cuban anthropologist and ethnologist Fernando Ortiz Fernandez, despite the structures of the economy. Politically, this has meant that, in general, a kind of hostile us versus them dynamic has not taken deep root, except maybe an expat, of course, Miami, Cuba. But on the island, it's because the bureaucrats who may sit at the other end of the citizens' complaint are also fellow Cubans, and just as likely are in a similar socioeconomic place themselves. In terms of political ideas and models, there are several examples of continuity with the past. I mentioned earlier the historical and active presence of a Cuban Communist Party in Cuban politics until it was chased underground during the Cold War under American pressure. This makes the term communist more normalized in a Cuban context than when, for example, Americans or Canadians hear it. Another example lies in the economic nationalist and corporatist and statist antecedents found in the plans of none other than the same Fulgencio Batista in the late 1930s, which could be considered to have been, in fact, quite kind of left-leaning or progressive. There's state intervention in the sugar industry, protection of small sugar farmers, collaboration with the trade unions in business, minimum wages, social benefits, etc. Later, so-called Cubanization programs to insist on a certain level of Cuban ownership of sugar mills and the hiring of Cuban workers, as well as de facto nationalizations of foreign-owned utilities, at the time upset American business in Cuba and therefore the US government. Many of these programs felt, frankly, pretty similar, at least in the spirit of economic nationalism, to some of what a Castro government would do later. But they predated the revolution by years. Another example is the very Cuban phenomenon of what one might call, what I call the Exile Rotation, in which opponents of the government of the day would be expelled from the country, and then, after the passage of time, generally permitted to come back, to return. This practice dates from the Spanish colonial days and continues to this day. The second element of the answer to how the Cuban Revolution is still in place, I believe, involves political communications. Trained initially in the use of political symbolism by an early mentor who was a colorful Cuban politician by the name of Eddie Chibas, Fidel Castro made the Cuban Revolution synonymous with Cuban patriotism and nationalism, cloaking the revolution in the flag. If we were to see it as a marketing exercise, it was a success. Now, while that hold on kind of the nationalist cred, if you will, has lessened in the post-Castro era, it is still the case that to this day, the real cult of personality in Cuba is that of José Martí, whose bust is in every schoolyard, every parquet throughout the country. And other historic figures from the 19th century wars of independence against Spain have recently been dusted off and added to the pantheon of Cuban patriotic heroes. The consequence has been to create a kind of inverted equation in Cuba. The more hostile and aggressive is the posture of the United States, the more reinforced the Cuban government is as a repository of Cuban pride and patriotism. So on the island itself, the US embargo is perceived widely not as anti-regime, but as anti-Cuban, which triggers a kind of limbic nationalist reflex among most of those who, in fact, are opposed to the government. I think this is a pretty fundamental miscalculation in Washington. On the other hand, the opening between the United States and Cuba, orchestrated and announced jointly by both former Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro in December 2014, was extremely and overwhelmingly popular on the street in Cuba among everyday Cubans, because it signaled for the first time some kind of hope for a more normal future. But of course, that effervescence was short-lived with the arrival of Donald J. Trump. In the absence of multi-party democratic elections to confer political legitimacy, the Cuban version of legitimacy has derived from a kind of unwritten social contract. At its core, the social contract kind of goes like this. We, the people of Cuba, will give you, the state, time, provided, oops, I'm out of order here, excuse me, provided you maintain as much universal free education and health care as possible, ensure a reliable food supply, electricity, and transportation. Driven by the younger, educated urban professional class, access to the internet was added to the social contract in the last decade. It has, of course, frayed seriously under economic and budgetary pressures, but it exists. The social contract is proven informally to be a flexible and quite adaptable tool in tying government performance, the perception of government performance or not, to key societal needs. If, however, the state cannot meet the basic terms of the social contract, then I think political trouble looms. Lastly, there's the idea of multiple Cuban revolutions in phases. As the revolution has morphed and adapted and evolved over time, the Cuba of 2022 looks very different than that of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, especially after the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the International Socialist Trading Order. The creation of private sector, as well as recognition of private property and the key role of foreign investment in the economic development of the country are examples of that. Only the most starry-eyed international leftist could perceive Cuba as a utopian success story. Not even the Cuban political leadership sees the country in that way. There's an array of challenges, some material and some societal and political. Younger generations of Cubans are generally much less anchored in the historical nationalist symbolism of grievance with the United States and that kind of package of real and perceived insult and offense that fueled Cuban nationalism during the 20th century and helped nurture the seed of the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Unmoored from this context, under or unemployed, not seeing a future of opportunity, many young Cubans are like the free atoms of physics. At the other end of the life journey, the need to provide social security and care to the elderly in Cuban society is a pressing need with scarce resources. And as discussed briefly earlier, the issue of race is a factor in marginalized communities and social groups. I'll just quickly touch on one or two more pieces. The demonstrations that took place in various cities and towns across Cuba on July the 11th of last summer, in which you might have seen images on television, brought many of these domestic issues and challenges bubbling to the fore. They also suggested a need for ways to incorporate wider and more diverse public participation in the civic affairs of the country, concrete and more sustained attention to marginalized communities and sectors of Cuban society, and greater freedom and independence of creative expression as Cuba continues to evolve. But the reaction to July the 11th also laid bare some other facets of the Cuban reality. In the quite well-organized social media machinery of the Cuban expatriate world, particularly in Miami, Florida, of course, attempted immediately at that time to kind of create a narrative that expunged the effects of the U.S. embargo on Cuban economic development, and by extrapolation, to set aside the entire U.S.-Cuba relationship as irrelevant. According to this quite sanitized version of a more complicated reality, the Cuban government alone was responsible for the troubling state of the Cuban economy. But in Cuba, multiple facts are equally true simultaneously. The Cuban government, like all governments, is responsible for its actions. At the same time, the deleterious impact of the U.S. embargo is an inconvenient truth that cannot be arbitrarily airbrushed away. When the Biden administration asserted that it stood with the Cuban demonstrators last July, what does such support mean? By the example of history, it actually means rhetorical exhortation to regime change, which continues to be the fundamental policy of the United States. Louis Perez Jr., he's professor of history and director of the Institute for the Study of the Americas at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a preeminent expert on the U.S.-Cuba relationship, he's excellent, has summarized what American support means. Quote, "To stand with the Cuban people has meant armed intervention, military occupation, regime change, and political meddling, all normal events in U.S.-Cuba relations in the 60 years before the Cuban Revolution. In the 60 years after the revolution, standing with the Cuban people has meant diplomatic isolation, armed invasion, covert operations, and economic sanctions," end quote. The Cuban trova singer Carlos Manuel Puebla once wrote, "Los caminos de mi Cuba nunca van a donde deben. The roads of my Cuba never lead where they should." In this context, as parties to the current version of the Cuban memory wars, both foreign and Cuban, fail to understand Cuban history, they may well find that the next generation of Cuban activists on the island are again Cuban nationalists, and the cycle repeats itself. Thank you. So, very open to questions, and I think I'm supposed to kind of run it myself. So, I have so much authority. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Michael.
Hi, how you doing?
Two key relationships I would think would be with the United States and Russia over the many decades.
Yes.
We've talked a lot about the U.S. Obviously, the relationship to Russia changed a lot in 1990-91, and the economy before that was very dependent upon Russia buying sugar and other
Correct.
exports of Cuba. So my question is, how has that relationship changed in the last number of decades, and how dependent is Cuba today on Russia, if at all?
Sure. You're absolutely right. The relationship changed quite dramatically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Cuban GDP just cratered. It lost about 2/3 of its GDP. The Russians picked up and left. For those of you who have been in Havana, you might have seen the huge Russian embassy, which back in its day was, like a fortress, covered in, antenna and satellite dishes and listening posts and all that kind of stuff. The Russians literally picked up and left. And were gone for a long time. Cuba pivoted to direct foreign investment to substitute for the socialist trading system, repaired diplomatic relations with a number of countries which they either had let lag or didn't have, Latin America, etc. They focused a great deal on relations with the European Union, with Mexico, with Canada, etc. Attempted to close the gap with the United States. The Russians, about, I would say, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, started to come back. And in a different scenario, they came back as business people. They came back as tourists. On the streets of Havana, you would start to see, because this was a time when young Russian urban professionals were traveling, and so they'd be showing up as tourists. The Russian government increasingly started to warm again. Nothing like the previous relationship of the Soviet days, of course. But, for example, entered into a number of business arrangements to modernize the Cuban railway system, for example, and just recently forgave another tranche of Cuban debt. So I think the relationship, for the Cubans, the relationship with Russia is an important one. It's historic. It's got background to it, but they're not. I don't perceive them. They're not dependent on it anymore. Nor I don't think would they particularly wish to be. They're careful about the relationship with Russia, and maybe to preempt any other questions about maybe Ukraine a little bit. Oh, I don't want to preempt anything, but they're very careful about. You may have noticed the way they publicly are dealing with this current situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is an exercise in threading the needle. John.
In my medical discipline, nephrology, I went between 1999 and 2005, 2006. I went to Cuba several times. What was impressive was the public health. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a very low maternal death rate. Infantile mortality was very low. And they cooperated very well in various projects. For example, we had one worldwide dealing with preventing kidney disease. They then segregated a population of 100,000 on the island of Youth to study very exhaustively, where they were very impoverished when it came to any specialties.
Yes.
In fact, they were very innovative, just like they could keep 1960 Chevrolets still on the streets 40, 50 years later. They would, on a shoestring, have nuclear medicine apparatus and so on. But it was very hard to, at a more sophisticated subject, to teach them, because I was once shocked. I was talking about chronic kidney disease, where you have to be very careful with elements like calcium and phosphorus. Mm-hmm. And I said, you have to control the phosphorus. And a hand came up in the back and it says, we can't measure phosphorus. Now, any lab in a small town in North America and the world measures phosphorus.
Sure.
But it showed you the great limitations that were present there at that time.
Sure. But
the people were very convivial, and they went abroad at that time, and we had very good relationships. And I phoned Jose for years. Now, his salary as chief was $10 a month.
Yeah.
He was very careful, though. I was in his home, and when I entered in his house, you had to open up multiple locks to get into the door. So I think they were kind of worried about people coming in and all that story. So all that's sort of by the way. So I better ask you the question before. Now, my second question is the great antipathy of the Cubans in Miami against those in Cuba. How do you address that? And with the current Ukraine crisis, the issue came up yesterday after Biden's speech was Russia has a number of friends, like Venezuela, perhaps Cuba. What do we do with them if we're trying to have Western countries together against this onslaught in Ukraine, which is certainly an illegal war by any stretch?
Right. Thanks, John. I'll start maybe with your second one first. As I was just mentioning, The Cubans are in a little bit of a sticky wicket vis-a-vis the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and are threading a needle, in my opinion, here quite carefully. And I think their position is predicated on several things. The Russians are net useful to them, and there's some historical baggage or some historical memory, but they have a diplomatic relationship with Ukraine. And embedded in the Cuban official psyche is, in general, a great deal of respect for the institutions of the international system, in the sense of the United Nations, all the United Nations specialized agencies, the conventions like the Vienna Conventions, all of this. The Cubans are very formalistic and legalistic about these things, and they put a lot of stock in that. So the needle they're trying to thread is, the Russians are kind of helpful to them right now. The Ukrainians don't give them that much, but on the other hand, for the consistency of their policy positions internationally, they can't really condone the kind of military action that they saw. So what you've seen from the Cubans, and I think you'll probably continue to see, is them going right through the middle, saying, well, the United States has a very big role to play in this because of eastward NATO expansion. It would be the thing, which is, a Russian national security argument, but it has to be resolved by diplomatic negotiations, and they need to get on with it. So that's what they're trying to do with Ukraine. Dealing with the Miami Cuban community, the Miami Cuban community has changed a lot in recent years. You've got a younger demographic. You've got the politics have shifted. Until the last election, but still they've shifted quite considerably. The Democratic Party has done better in Miami, in Cuban Miami, in recent elections. I believe President Obama actually won Cuban Miami. They didn't do so well last time, which has upset the Florida Democratic Party because they thought that President Biden's positions on the Cuba reset were too easily twisted around by the Trump campaign to be soft on communism. So there's sensitivity to that. But I think the reality of the Cuban American community is it's also relatively nuanced. It's got different generations. There's a number of Cuban Americans who, when they were allowed to travel back to Cuba, went in very large numbers to visit family. There's a growing number of Cubans who are tired of this endless enmity and just want to get on with things, family reunification, be reunited, be able to travel. They support tremendously remittances, to be able to send a remittance back to their families. And the Cubans have a particular view of the Cuban American community writ large. They're all Cubans, all welcome, come, except a couple of what they consider to be bad apple types, and we don't want to deal with you. But they're able to kind of separate the community apart into different component parts.
I meant to ask you about the Havana Syndrome.
Oh my goodness, Havana Syndrome. Unfortunately for the Cubans, it got called the Havana Syndrome because it's showing up in other places as well. I cannot profess to any inside knowledge of what the heck this thing is. And I don't think anybody really knows. It's extremely mysterious, whatever is going on here. What I can say with some considerable confidence, knowing the Cubans, and partly against the background of what I said earlier about their respect for things like the Vienna Convention, protection of foreign diplomats on their national soil, sovereignty issues. They're responsible for what happens in Cuba. I find it almost incomprehensible, or almost impossible to believe that the Cuban government itself in any formal sanctioned way, or the Cuban intelligence services, launched an offensive attack against foreign diplomats on their own soil. This so far from the way the Cubans operate. Did somebody else do something unsanctioned? Plausible. So I think it's still an ongoing mystery. I don't even think there's scientific consensus on what exactly it all is. There's millions of theories. We may never know, frankly. The other thing, the Cubans have been quite cooperative, to their credit, with both the FBI and the RCMP in investigating this. But it has not produced any smoking gun that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Would you care to speculate on the governance of Cuba after Raul Castro?
Well, they've launched their post-Castro transition, as you know. Raul Castro's still around, by the way. He's first secretary of the Communist Party. So he's did kind of disappear off to the ranch. But in terms of the kind of everyday operations of the Cuban state, it is really now run by a different crowd. They have a new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, and he, as all new leaders do, had a bit of a fresh broom, lots of personnel changes and that kind of thing. So it's slightly a different crowd. My view is that Cuba is in an evolutionary state. We don't really know where it's going to end up. I don't even think the Cubans truly know. But as I mentioned earlier, it's quite an adaptive animal, the Cuban system. And my personal guess for crystal ball gazing is that once they can get out of the COVID-19 period, which has had devastating economic impacts, like in many, many other places, but has hit them hard. They closed all their borders, lost all their tourism, all that kind of thing. Once they can kind of get out of that, they've written off the United States, by the way, for, there's going to be no Biden reset, none of that. But get back enough to business to kind of get back on their feet, settle themselves a bit. My personal prediction is that the evolution will continue to increasing growth of the private sector. I have no predictions on when there may be political liberalizations in terms of, democratic elections or anything like that. But a continued evolution towards greater economic liberalization and social and creative liberalization, I think, over time as well. I think that's how they don't believe there's many other options, even if they wanted to. So I'm going to take some online questions if I could. This is a question, and I'll just read it to everybody. As an artist who has traveled to Cuba and have wonderful artist friends there, how would you define the role of the artist in present-day Cuba in terms of both opportunities and constraints? Artists in Cuba are cultural folk heroes. The arts in Cuba, in terms of the public appreciation of them, the level of attainment and achievement, is one of the real defining characteristics of Cuba. They put a lot of time into training. The schools, these Cuban artists are kind of trained in a kind of a classical way, so many of them. They have phenomenal, art schools and dance schools and ballet, et cetera, et cetera. The Cubans, deeply appreciate the contribution of the cultural industries, which is not this can be said for not all countries. In Cuba, this is true, and they have kind of, in some cases, almost a cult-like status. And the government of Cuba understands, I believe, because they have quite attuned political antenna, that one has to be careful around the artistic community. A number of those, and the artistic community also in Cuba has more general freedoms and liberties than in terms of foreign travel. Partly they can afford it, the successful ones, and they live, middle-class lives, the successful ones, not everybody. Recently, and quite a significant number of Cuban artists have been actively campaigning with the Cuban government to allow greater space for creative expression. And I think this is an issue the government's got to deal with. And they are playing a leading role in this. And it's one of the kind of the political issues that's on the table. The reality of Cuba, and I always just want to make sure that I'm very clear-minded when I speak about these things. The desire for greater creative space, I think, is, in my own opinion, I think in that of most Cubans, is a laudable and correct one. One of the problems in having these dialogues in the United States is the residual effect, and I know I'm going to sound a bit boring saying this, of the positioning and embargo of the United States. Because what the Americans do, in a slightly clumsy way, although they would not like that characterization, is to insert themselves through all kinds of crazy ideas into the public space in Cuba that skews and taints dialogue between Cuban actors like artists and the government. Because of the regime change narrative, it's very easy, and the support for artists, let's say artist protesters, the link is too easily then made that that the artists are acting as agents of a foreign power whose objective mission is to destroy them. So you see, so the artists have to operate in a very particular space and very carefully, but they're highly respected. I personally think they're highly respected in large swaths of the Cuban government itself.
Thank you. My only experience in Cuba was with Canada World Youth.
Yeah.
So
Oh my gosh. Yes, I remember.
We visited the families that took in our members, and it was extremely
Jacques
interesting.
Hébert, Senator Hébert.
I was there with Jacques. Yeah.
There you go.
So the interesting thing I came away with was, for all their courtesy, their eye was entirely on the U.S., and Canada was simply kind of a way of getting to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what you would say now about policy that Canada should take toward Cuba under the current circumstances.
Right. Thank you. That's an interesting question, and Canada has had a special and unique relationship with Cuba, objectively speaking, and it has, and over 70 years, unbroken. Only Mexico, as you know, has a similar unbroken relationship. That provided a fair amount of currency, if you will, for our relationship with the Cubans, and was something that the Cubans respected tremendously. I think with the passage of time, that kind of special relationship is like a little bit like an isotope with a half-life. It's sitting on the shelf and it's losing its asset, its attributes, as time ticks by. And I think there was a long period in the relationship between Canada and Cuba when the relationship went on autopilot, or in some periods under certain prime ministers, it was, set aside, frankly. Never broken, but just, we're not going to do anything. And so over time, the Cubans have come to wonder, where is Canada? Like this vaunted relationship that we have, where are the Canadians? They never come. They don't, tourists do. Tourists come in huge numbers. But at a political level, political visits, political ministers, senior business leaders, they don't come. They come from France and Germany and Mexico and all over the place. Canadians rarely come. So there's been a curiosity for some time, I think, in the Cuban leadership and parts of the government about sort of where is Canada. And I think the Cubans are interesting to us. And my view, I'm not a serving diplomat anymore, so I can say whatever I want. I do think it is worth the dedication of some, additional resources, even from what we do now, to reset the relationship a little bit, because partly too because of that issue that I just touched on earlier about the kinds of relationships the Cubans maintain that we don't have. And they can be quite constructive and helpful. They can be quite constructive in the hemisphere. There are case studies in the past where they have been very helpful to us and to the international community in general. And I'm thinking, for example, you may remember the hostage crisis at the Japanese embassy in Lima, Peru, with the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Army, or whatever they were called at the time, sort of Marxist-Leninist Maoist types, who held all these diplomats. The Cubans played a very largely unknown, but very helpful bridging, constructive role with the guerrillas who held that embassy hostage. They also, for example, facilitated and provided safe haven for the negotiation of the peace accords between the Colombian government and FARC, for example, using Havana as a safe haven. It took months, and facilitated and brought the FARC to those negotiations, which allowed that peace accord to take place. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of about why Canada should spend some time. Don't have to agree with them all the time, but we invested in that relationship over 7 decades. You know, let's not ensure that it not kind of evaporate by sort of, negligence.
We have 2 more questions.
Yes.
Is that okay? Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll take one from the room and one online.
Thank you. Thank you for your refreshing and sophisticated analysis of Cuba.
Oh, thank you.
And historically sensitive also. In a sense, you're going against the U.S. foreign policy produced caricature account of the state. Right. Cuban government, like a number of other governments that have been under prolonged and sustained sanctions, they cannot sort of live and reproduce themselves, rule by being just tyrannical and dictatorial. They have to be creative. And that's what you brought out, I thought, that is creative in local policies. Maybe they are very fixed on independence in relationship with the United States, but internally, in order to be able to mobilize consent, mobilize support, they have to be very creative and how they do it. And in fact, in some instances, this is also similar, the Cuban case, similar to Iran. In Iran, likewise, artists, poets, writers have flourished. Why? Because the regime finds it necessary to be creative in various domains. And in a sense, the key question is that these historically prolonged sanctions creates a regime that really actually become very creative in mass mobilization, building popular support.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. And the other thing that prolonged exposure to that kind of embargo regime, and these are embargoes, by the way, that are extremely comprehensive, as you guys know, with the extraterritorial reach and power of the U.S. government to reach globally across the world to third-party actors. This is not kind of some regulation somewhere. This is a full-on economic assault on another state with the intention of regime change. It is. It just simply is. And one could debate whether the objective's correct or not, but that is it. The other piece that it creates is indirectly as one of the byproducts, if you will, of this prolonged exposure, is a tremendous resilience and an ability to find default ways of workaround is one side of it, but also a kind of a social resilience, even at the societal level, because people become grudgingly, but quite good at surviving, and it becomes a survivalist culture in some ways, and it's unfortunate. But I spend a lot of time on family relations. There's a lot of time on community, because communities has to support everybody. For example, when hurricanes hit in Cuba, I remember, you remember the images of Hurricane Katrina, and I know it's a different, and I want to be, just careful about some of the comparisons, but I think it's valid. Katrina, looting, social order breaking down, all kinds of stuff in New Orleans. In Cuba, none of that. There's no looting, no stealing. People can almost leave their places. Of course, there's theft and robbery. I'm not saying there isn't, but it's this kind of sense of, under prolonged exposure to economic hardship, part of which is created by the embargo. Not all of it, part of it, a large part, creates this kind of sense that all for one and one for all, and your community is important to you, which then translates into a kind of a societal resilience that's quite powerful. I have another question from Luc Lapointe. Where do you see the hard currency gap going for Cuba to address the payments in arrears to Canadian companies? How political can this become in the trading relations? Thanks, Luke. Because of the macroeconomic pressures on Cuba, payment problems are omnipresent and have been a feature of the Cuban business environment for a long time. Canadian companies, but all foreign companies, have to enter Cuba and plan for extensive payment periods and deferred payments, etc. It's, in a way, part of the business environment, and it's not for the faint of heart. I think that the Cuban intent is always to pay its debts. They will, though, rob Peter to pay Paul, to keep things kind of, moving along as much as they can. And in some cases, companies do face payment delays. And they've spent considerable amount of time and prioritized as well payment of their international debt to the Paris Club, for example, because the Cubans have realized that without effectively a decent international credit rating, they can't borrow again. So the repayment of debt is an important part of their economic development policy toolbox. And all I can say is that, I think ultimately people will get paid when they can get paid. I don't know the case of each individual case. I think increasingly companies, because of currency issues in Cuba, will have to look at ways of structuring their business relationships with the Cubans to hold bank accounts and assets, for example, offshore, if they're going to, do it in hold hard currency accounts. So that sometimes interventions by the central bank to manage liquidity and hard currency flows don't affect them. I don't have any grand advice for companies except that you entered with a strategic vision, and you gotta kind of just hold tight and go for the ride. And I think eventually you'll get paid. And does it affect the political relationship between Canada and Cuba? These are kinds of issues that come up, I think, periodically, probably quite often in the political dialogue between the two governments. At the end of the day, if there ain't no money at a given moment in time, there's nothing to pay you with. So I think it involves creativity and patience. So we're good?
Thank you very much for outstanding and engaging.
Thank you. Thank you.